Hi everyone, my name is Fiona Deutsch and I'm the analyst on the Climate and Environment team at ACCR. And I'd like to welcome you today to our webinar on our analysis of BHP's Climate Transition Action Plan. So thank you so much for joining us today. I'd like to begin to acknowledge that we're all dialing in from different places all over the globe. I myself live and work on Yagara country, which is based in Brisbane in Queensland in the northeast of Australia. I would like to acknowledge that sovereignty was never ceded and that it always was and always will be Aboriginal land. And I'd like to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. So I'm joined here today by Dan Wellsby and Dr. Steve Pye from UCL, who are the authors of the recent Nature paper, Unextractable Fossil Fuels in a 1.5 degree World. We're also joined by Joe Brooks from InfluenceMap, who will speak to BHP's lobbying impacts. And finally, our very own Harriet Kater, ACCR's climate lead, who will discuss ACCR's assessment of BHP's Climate Transition Action Plan. Now, before I pass on to our speakers, a bit of housekeeping to keep things running smoothly. This webinar is being recorded and it's going to be uploaded to our YouTube channel within the next 24 hours. If you hover over the bottom of your Zoom screen, you should be able to see a Q&A button. So if you have any questions, please type them in there. We're going to have ample time at the end of the presentations tonight to have a robust Q&A session. So please feel free to pop your questions into that chat section as they come to mind throughout the presentations. We'll also be joined by Dan Gosha, ACCR's Director of Climate and Environment, for the Q&A session at the end of the presentations. So without further ado, I will pass on to our first speaker, Dan Wellsby.
Great, yeah, thanks, Fiona. Good morning, or probably more accurately, good evening, everyone who's joining. My name is Dan Wellsby, and I was the lead author of a University College London paper, which was recently published in Nature, called Unextractable Fossil Fuels in a 1.5 degree World. And I'm very pleased to be joined by my colleague, Steve Pye from the UCL Energy Institute. So just a bit of background to why we essentially, the kind of narrative, the main narrative around this paper. At the moment, we see our energy system is dominated by fossil fuels. So annually, we are emitting around 40 gigatons of carbon dioxide, and that's really dominated by the energy system. So around 85% of those global CO2 emissions are from the energy system, and that's really driven by consumption of oil, coal, and natural gas. So if we want to meet net zero by the 2050s, or what we call here the landing zone, so essentially for most of the models that run scenarios that meet net zero by 2050 or afterwards, the landing zone is heavily dependent on the level of temperature overshoot and the level of carbon dioxide removal technologies within each scenario. So you can see there that we've got an incredibly significant challenge. So in 2020, the United Nations Environment Programme and the Stockholm Environment Institute released the production gap report. And this essentially showed the disconnect between what is required to try and limit global temperatures to 1.5 degrees based on the most up-to-date climate science. So the IPCC special report on 1.5 and the more recent assessment report 6. And the disconnect between fossil fuel production pathways consistent with limiting to those kind of temperatures and country fossil fuel production plans. So you can see on the red line, this is the individual countries' production plans and trajectories, or projections, and the incredible disconnect there between the purple line at the bottom, which is production consistent with 1.5 degrees. So essentially, we need a reverse course from the pathway that we are currently on. So to limit global temperature rise to 1.5 degrees and to meet net zero, the vast majority of fossil fuel resources need to remain in the ground. So you can see, the embodied carbon within the total fossil fuel resource base is nearly 12,000 gigatons. And you can see on the red dotted line, that's a carbon budget consistent with a 50% probability of keeping global temperatures to 1.5 degrees. And that's 580 gigatons from 2018 onwards. So you can see from that, you know, the vast majority of these resources need to remain in the ground. So kind of to assess the regional distribution of fossil fuel reserves and resources which need to remain unextracted, and to kind of generate some regional production pathways for different fossil fuels, we used a global energy system model called TAM-UCL. TAM finds the least cost or the optimal energy system to satisfy a set of exogenous energy service demands. And I think the optimization part of this is really important. So it's finding the least cost energy system. We use a normative approach, and by that I mean we apply a cumulative global carbon budget of 580 gigatons from 2018 going forward permanently. And the model generates production pathways for each region. And therefore from that it also determines what volume of fossil fuels and fossil fuel reserves and resources are left in the ground. The regional distribution then is really dependent on the cost of developing fossil fuel resources. It's dependent on the carbon intensity of production of different fossil fuel categories. It's dependent on the cost of low carbon technologies, and that includes both zero carbon technologies like variable renewables, and it also depends on the cost of things like carbon capture and storage technologies. And then within all of that, the model then generates endogenously generates a carbon price, or the marginal cost of abatement. So a key building block of our analysis within the model is the cost of extraction of different fossil fuels. I apologize that on these graphs you can't really pick out Australia. It is kind of challenging to, but this should kind of give you an insight into the kind of the underlying cost dynamics within the model for different types of fossil fuels. So on the left we have oil, in the middle we have fossil methane gas, and on the right hand side we have coal. So just some headline findings then from our paper. We found that globally nearly 60% of oil and fossil methane gas reserves need to remain unextracted, and we found that 90% of coal needs to remain unextracted. And by reserves here, we mean what is considered economically recoverable and geologically recoverable today. In terms of the regional distribution then, what we found was that there are relative winners and losers within our cost optimization framework. So for example, for oil, we found that Canada and Central and South America leave higher than the global average proportion of their oil reserves in the ground. And that's really kind of, driven by the cost of those reserves. So for example, in Canada, it's heavily dependent on oil sands. And in Central and South America, there is a lot of ultra heavy oil in places like Venezuela. And also the carbon intensity of those reserves. For fossil methane gas, we found that the Middle East and former Soviet Union leave higher than 60% of their gas reserves in the ground. And that's really reflecting the size of the reserve base. So those two regions combined hold about 65 to 70% of the global gas reserve. And then finally for coal, we found that it really is the developed economies which leave an incredibly high share of their coal unextracted in the ground. Apologies, that will be a fire alarm at UCL. Okay, it's just a drill. Apologies, everyone. That was not great timing. So as I was saying, so the developed economies leave kind of a significantly higher share of their coal reserves in the ground. So we found that the USA and Australia, the USA is leaving 97% of its coal, and Australia is leaving 95% of its coal unextracted. And that's really driven by incredibly rapid rates of coal production decline within the model. And coal consumption decline. What we find is that the developed economies are really phasing coal out of the energy system incredibly rapidly, which is leaving, and I say this, very, very slightly more room within the global carbon budget for places in other parts of developing Asia, China, and India. So globally, in terms of production trajectories, we're seeing that oil and gas and coal production need to have peaked already. So for oil and gas, we find that there is an average annual decline of around 3% per year. And for coal, it's between 6 and 7% per year, every year out to 2050. So most regions are facing, an incredibly strong or an incredibly rapid decline of fossil fuel production. kind of global coal dynamics. So as I said previously, we find globally that from 2020, coal declines or coal production declines at an average annual rate of 6.5%. To give that some context to the recently released IEA net zero report, that was around 7% on average per year. So we're really kind of heavily aligned with the IEA's net zero report. As I also said, this is driven by, sectorally, this is driven by rapid consumption decline in power and industry. And the demand destruction within key markets or key export markets, particularly for large coal exporters, is really driving these production dynamics. So, China, India, and other parts of developing Asia are seeing year-on-year consumption decline of around 6%. In the iron and steel sector specifically, we're seeing that coal consumption decreases by at least 60% by 2050. So that has, significant implications for the export of coking coal. And in terms of Australia specifically, we're seeing a faster than average global decline rate in terms of production. So we're seeing that this declines at an average of 10% per year on average. And that's actually faster than we see in the model for places like the United States and Europe. Oh, sorry, it's not as fast as we see for the United States and Europe. And then finally, so to give these numbers some context, by 2030, the entire Australia's entire production is exported, and that is around 120 million tons. So to put this into context, that's around a 70% reduction on 2018 production levels. So, we're seeing incredibly rapid production declines here to meet our 1.5 degree target. So just finally, some recent developments in the decarbonisation of key coal consuming sectors. So this is what's happening at the moment. So we're seeing that around 20 to 25% of global steel production is committed to net zero by 2050. We've seen Arcel or Mittal, the second largest steel producer, publicly say that they have a target of net zero by 2050. And we have Fortescue recently committing to net zero, all three scope 1 to 3 emissions by 2040. And that's really driven by, or can be driven by a focus on the circular economy and green steel border adjustments for steel. So essentially pricing of steel based on the carbon content of the production pathways. We're seeing an increasing focus on green hydrogen clusters around iron and steel producers, and there's been a lot of interest in India, in particular around this area. And we've seen the creation of the Steel Zero Group, where members are required to be committed to net zero emissions, scope 1 to 3 by 2050. We've also recently seen large reductions in coal consumption, particularly in the United States and Europe, where it's averaged between 6 and 7% per year. And that's really been driven by reductions in the power sector. And for the first time in 2020, in the first quarter of 2020, we saw higher retirement of coal power plants than new additions. So I think that's kind of, that's it from us. Thank you for listening. I apologize again for the impromptu fire alarm. But I will pass on to the next speaker.
So now I'm going to pass on to Joe Brooks from InfluenceMap, and he's going to speak to BHP's lobbying impacts.
Thanks, Fiona. Hope you can see you all see my screen here. Yeah, my name is Joe Brooks. I'm a senior analyst. I lead on our Climate Action 100 research at InfluenceMap. And yeah, I'm going to be talking about the lobbying side of BHP's transition plan and just their general activities. So very quickly, a brief background about InfluenceMap and the lobbying issue. So we're an independent think tank, founded in 2015 and based in London. There are two key sides to InfluenceMap. There's LobbyMap, which assesses the climate policy engagement by companies and their industry associations. There's also FinanceMap, which looks at the climate performance of asset managers across their portfolios. And you see this graphic at the bottom here. So we focus on a company's impact on policy and the wider narrative around climate change, rather than their emissions and the business model. That being said, analysis of climate lobbying is very important to understanding a company's business model. So why does this matter? So firstly, companies or sectors may be delaying implementation of the Paris Agreement, which conflicts with their stated goals and the stated goals of shareholders. Companies may be utilizing policy capture to prop up outdated business models, and inconsistent behavior by company on climate policy. It could indicate serious compliance and governance issues. So in other words, lobbying activities are being used to support business strategies that are not fully aligned with the goals of the Paris Agreement. So a reflection on climate lobbying is very, very relevant to understanding BHP's broader approach and strategy on climate change. A very quick overview of our methodology. So our database tracks and scores around 300 companies and 150 industry associations on their climate policy engagement. So we define policy engagement in line with the UN. So this can include a range of activities, including advertising, social media, and direct engagement with policymakers. We define climate policy as past, currently evolving, and potential future policy measures motivated by the Paris Agreement. To do this, we collect data from 7 publicly accessible data sources. And this can include company disclosures, CEO statements, reliable media reporting, and others. And then each evidence item is individually scored against Paris Agreement aligned benchmarks. So what this process can do is build up hundreds of items of evidence for each entity. And this provides a robust assessment of whether a company's lobbying activities are in fact aligned with the Paris Agreement. What does this look like for BHP? So this is an overview of our assessment of BHP's lobbying, both direct and indirect. It's based on 300 items of evidence, around 75 of which have been inputted since 2020. And you see at the top here that this performance band metric is the first one. This is a full measure of a company's direct and indirect climate policy engagement. And it's scored D here, which indicates obstructive climate policy engagement. This metric is made up of 2 other metrics, the organization score, which measures direct policy engagement, and the relationship score, which measures indirect climate policy engagement. As you can see here, they're both under 50% here, which indicates misalignment between their direct and indirect lobbying activities and the Paris Agreement. And finally, at the bottom here, we have engagement intensity. This is a measure of the level and intensity of a company's policy engagement. So any scores above 25 here indicates highly active or strategic engagement with climate policy. And as you can see, BHP scores 35% here. So this suggests they are very active on climate lobbying. What we have noticed is that even though there's been some improvements in BHP's top line messaging, the score hasn't actually improved since 2017, which has limited progress in that time. So how does lobbying fit in BHP's Climate Transition Action Plan, which is being voted on next month? So climate policy engagement is a key pillar of the plan. Within this plan, BHP has positive top-line messaging on climate change and policy. For example, they support ambitious action in line with global net zero emissions, and they urge governments to set clear commitments aligned with the Paris Agreement goals. But what our assessment finds is that there's a big disconnect between these positive high-level statements in the Climate Transition Action Plan and BHP's real-life climate policy engagement, both direct and indirect. If we take a look at BHP's direct climate policy engagement, this is a very brief overview. We have a company profile for BHP with access to all the underlying data there, if you're interested in looking a bit more closely. But I'll give a very brief overview. So BHP has previously opposed ambitious climate policies at the state and federal level in Australia. So for example, in 2019, they successfully lobbied to weaken greenhouse gas assessment guidance by Western Australia, and also lobbied to weaken the safeguard mechanism in Australia, which is a big part of the Australia climate policy there. What we've noticed in the last 2 years is they have a lot less direct, transparent engagement with specific climate regulations in 2020 and 2021. But this analysis suggests this is not an indication of reform. They haven't offered any corrections or revisions to their previous opposition, and their communication is still focused on promoting a long-term role of fossil fuels in the energy mix. So we've got a couple of examples here. So for example, in May 2021, CEO Mike Henry advocated a sustained role for coal in the energy mix for decades. And they've also used social media quite consistently to promote a coal agenda in 2020-21. BHP is a highly influential global company. So these communications on the energy mix can really carry a lot of weight, especially when actively contradicting IPCC and the IEA guidance on the role for coal and other fossil fuels in the energy mix. To move on to their indirect engagement. So our database tracks over 150 industry associations and scores them in exactly the same way as we score companies, which allows comparison between the two. As you can see here, BHP holds 11 memberships to industry associations on our database, which have climate policy engagement misaligned with the Paris Agreement. You see most of these are based in Australia, but there's also the American Petroleum Institute, US Chamber of Commerce, and the Canadian Association of Petroleum Producers as well. Out of the 50 Australian companies we cover in our database, we found that BHP has the largest network of industry associations lobbying against Paris-aligned climate policy. So this really suggests that BHP relies really heavily on these relationships to indirectly influence climate policy. So just digging down into some of these industry associations, I'm quite conscious of time, so I'm going to skim over a few of them. But if we start with the American Petroleum Institute and the US Chamber of Commerce, so these two associations have really actively worked to hold back climate regulation in the US since the Paris Agreement. As you can see here, in the last month or so, they've been currently trying to undermine the US reconciliation bill. And this has been described as the US's last great chance at meaningful climate policy progress. So it's a really important piece of legislation that they're trying to weaken or undermine at the moment. So you can see last month, the API lobbied against the inclusion of a clean energy performance program and also methane pricing under the bill. And the US Chamber has also strongly critiqued the climate provisions in the US reconciliation bill. If we move down to the New South Wales Minerals Council and the Chamber of Minerals and Energy of Western Australia, so these state-based mining groups in Australia are really important and really influential in promoting a role for fossil fuels in the energy mix and also lobbying against ambitious climate policy at both the state and the federal level. If we move on to APPEA. So APPEA have been a huge influence in supporting the gas-fired recovery from COVID-19 in Australia. And you see here in the last month or two, they've been really actively lobbying to support a role for natural gas in the energy mix in the state of Victoria. For example, opposing a phase out of natural gas in their roadmap on energy, and also supporting the end of a ban on new gas field developments in Victoria. It's a similar story for the Minerals Council of Australia. So they've consistently lobbied for a continued role for coal in the energy mix over the last few years. And you see in this example here, so over the summer, they successfully lobbied to dilute the renewable energy mandate of the ARENA, which is a renewable energy agency designed to set up funding for renewable energy projects. And this is to include funding for unproven at scale technologies such as carbon capture and storage to be used alongside fossil fuel projects. Finally, we've got the Queensland Resources Council. So I've highlighted these in yellow because it's currently unclear whether BHP is a member of the QRC. They suspended their membership last year, and there's been no sort of communication on it since, but they're still listed on the QRC website as a member. But what you can see here is that even since the suspension last year, there's been very limited progress by the Queensland Resources Council. They continue to lobby really strongly in favour of a role for coal in the energy mix, including new coal mines and gas projects in Australia. The last piece of this puzzle really is the BHP's Industry Association disclosures, which have been a big topic of conversation with investors recently. So this is referenced in the Climate Transition Action Plan and is also the subject of the resolution filed by ACCR. So BHP supported this resolution, which requested that the company strengthens its reviews of industry associations. So this is a positive step, but BHP's response suggests that it already believes its current approach is substantively aligned with what the resolution asks for, which our analysis suggests isn't the case. So we've developed our own methodology, to really evaluate the quality of these reviews. And what we found is that this methodology is benchmarked against investor expectations and also fact-checked against our own database of industry associations. As you can see from the scores there at the top, so BHP's review process has consistently fallen short of investor expectations since 2017. So why is that? So they failed to disclose their own policy positions and engagement activities on climate policy, and also those of its key industry associations. So while they disclose sort of top line positions on carbon pricing and things like that, they haven't disclosed positions on lobbying on specific items of climate policy. They also assess alignment against high level policy positions, such as support for carbon pricing or just simple support for the Paris Agreement, rather than the consistency of a industry association's lobbying with the Paris Agreement. And then as a result of this, BHP has failed to identify and take action on key industry associations engaged in counter to the Paris goals. So that slide a few moments ago showed this have 11 misalignments, 11 memberships to misaligned industry associations, and those are still unresolved currently. And what's the impact of this then? So one of BHP's main arguments is that they prefer to remain inside the tent and affect change from the inside of industry associations. This is a bad argument, and BHP has disclosed some progress made. But what our analysis finds is that these changes are usually high level and superficial. So for example, putting out a new climate change position statement supporting the Paris Agreement. Meanwhile, the underlying lobbying still remains unchanged. You see in the right-hand column here, there's very little change in the actual scores in the last 4 years. And all these associations in Australia are scored D or below, which suggests they're still misaligned with the Paris Agreement, which suggests that the engagement by BHP is currently having a minimal impact on the actual core lobbying activities of these groups. Finally, just put this slide up. Hopefully ACCR can share the slides afterwards. But these are my contact details and also a link to our new Australia platform, which launched last month. This looks at the top 50 Australian companies and 20 industry associations and has access to all the data underlying those assessments. Yeah, and that's it from me. So I'll pass back to Fiona, but thanks for listening.
Thanks, Joe. All right, everyone, our last speaker tonight is ACCR's Harriet Kater, who's going to speak about our assessment on BHP's Climate Transition Action Plan. So over to you, Harriet.
Thank you, Fiona. I am just finding my slides. Yeah, thanks very much, Fiona. Thanks, Joe, as well. We gave you 10 minutes to talk, and you probably could have had more time, but thank you very much for covering all of that. So yeah, good morning or evening to everyone who's joined us. Thanks very much for joining us today. I'm dialing in from Narragansett country on the Monero in far southern New South Wales. I would like to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and acknowledge that sovereignty was never ceded. So yep, as per this slide suggests, I'm here to talk about ACCR's analysis of BHP's Climate Transition Action Plan. Okay, first up, let's just address, what is a Say on Climate? The founder of the mechanism, Chris Hone, really believes Say on Climate is in the hands of investors. This mechanism, this opportunity to vote on climate transition plans at AGMs of major emitting companies, this can be as powerful as investors want it to be. It's really in your hands. But considering the climate chaos that we are observing across the globe, it's been a terrible time in the Northern Hemisphere summer with floods and fires raging. That's just with 1.2 degrees of warming. We're perilously close to 1.5 degrees, and that will see even more dire climate impacts. ACCR strongly encourages investors to use alignment with the Paris Agreement to inform voting for Say on Climate. And when you're approaching your vote for BHP, it's really important to remember that BHP has made a 3-yearly commitment to give this vote. So your next opportunity, as astutely observed in a Glass Lewis blog post a couple of days ago, your next opportunity will not be available until 2024. That's a significant amount of time, 3 years, considering how rapidly things are changing in terms of technology options, policies, the expectations of investors, of customers. So it's really important to get this decision right. And as stated, we implore investors to be as ambitious as possible when assessing these plans. All right, now we jump to BHP's contribution to climate change. So firstly, the Carbon Majors report that tracks companies' contribution to climate, to the accumulation of greenhouse gas emissions in the atmosphere. Over the 1965 to 2018 period, they found that BHP is the 19th largest contributor to climate change within that period. This heat map represents BHP's current footprint for FY21. Obviously, the most dominant source of emissions is their Scope 3, which comprises 96% of total footprint. Of those, iron ore is the largest source, comprising 62% of total emissions. We'll quickly turn now to BHP's emissions reduction performance to date. So BHP have a short-term emissions reduction target to maintain their operational emissions at or below their FY 2017 baseline, which has been adjusted to reflect their divestment of the gas assets, onshore gas assets in the US. So that baseline is 14.6 million tonnes per annum. But as you can see in this chart, from FY18 to FY21, BHP has been repeatedly tracking above that baseline. We understand that there's a series of renewable energy PPAs that are coming online in FY22, which will see them drop back down. But it's important to note that those surpassing of the baseline over multiple years, every year, in fact, until the final, we anticipate the final measurement year for the target of FY22, sees a significant contribution of emissions to the atmosphere, and is not really in keeping with what we need to see in terms of companies ratcheting down their emissions year on year and decreasing that drawdown of the available carbon budget. So that's something, just to keep in mind when monitoring BHP's tracking against its 2030 target. So jumping to those medium and long-term targets now. Firstly, I just want to address how BHP defines the difference between a goal and a target, because this table captures both. So a target, in essence, is binding. A goal is non-binding. BHP defines goals as ambitions to seek an outcome for which there is no current pathway. With regard to their current targets, the Transition Pathway Initiative has deemed that they're not aligned with a 1.5 degree pathway and do not capture BHP's most material Scope 3 emissions, which, as previously identified, particularly relate to steelmaking. So the targets that they've got in place for their Scope 1 and 2 operational emissions, they have a target to reduce these by at least 30% from FY20 levels. They have a net zero operational emissions target for 2050. And then their targets, rather than their goals for Scope 3, relate to net zero emissions by 2050 for direct suppliers and for shipping. And this following chart just demonstrates the materiality of those net zero targets compared to BHP's FY21 Scope 3 footprint. So the orange bars in that chart demonstrate which Scope 3 sources are captured by that net zero target. I'll just emphasise as well that steelmaking bar includes both the emissions from the processing of iron ore, BHP's iron ore, as well as the use of metallurgical coal produced by BHP. We jump now quickly to BHP's peers. We're conscious that within across sort of proxy advice and other sort of guidance, there's heavy reliance upon benchmarking of peers. The only benchmark ACCR really looks to use is alignment with the Paris Agreement. However, it still can be interesting to see where a company is sitting in comparison to its peers. And on that front, BHP is not a leader. So, for instance, we have Glencore. They have a 50% reduction target for 2035 that covers both all their Scope 1, 2 and 3 emissions. And of course, we have Fortescue Metals Group, who have an ambitious net zero operational emissions target for 2030. And as of yesterday, they've announced that they will be seeking to have net zero Scope 3 emissions, including steelmaking, by 2040. So moving now to what BHP is doing in order to meet that predominantly the 2030 target, but also its 2050 target for Scope 1 and 2. So you'll see in the Climate Change Transition Action Plan, there's been quite a lot of work in securing renewable power purchase agreements, particularly for the Chilean copper assets, as well as decarbonising electricity supply for the metallurgical coal mines across Queensland. Those PPAs will be coming into force over sort of 2022 to 2025, and we anticipate we will see a decrease in predominantly Scope 2, but I imagine some Scope 1 emissions as well. There might be some on-site power generation at those coal mines. Diesel, there is a focus on decreasing diesel consumption for material movement, predominantly looking at electrification, potentially some green hydrogen use in haulage equipment as well. That comprises 40% of BHP's total FY21 emissions. But there is also a pretty frequent reference to the use of offsets. So you might have observed in the CTAP document that anytime a target is stated, there is a footnote which states offsets will be used as required. This really leaves the door open and introduces some concern around BHP's intention to prioritise direct emissions reductions above everything else. And, I'm sure a number of you have your own concerns around the credibility of offsetting as a genuine decarbonisation strategy. We do too. One key contributor to our concern is a recent study which identified that there is an asymmetry between emitting carbon into the atmosphere and withdrawing it. So a CO2 emission into the atmosphere is more effective at raising CO2 than an equivalent CO2 removal is at lowering it. So that assumption that 1 tonne emitted and 1 tonne abated through an offset is actually incorrect. And increasing the imperative to prioritise direct emissions reductions above everything else. Okay, let's go to steel decarbonisation. Conscious about some of Dan's comments earlier around their assumptions for 2050. Between BHP and its peers, particularly FMG, there are divergent views and levels of ambition around how rapid the steel sector can be decarbonised. So Andrew Forrest from FMG has stated coal blast furnaces will be extinct by 2050, and this has been backed up by his net zero target for steelmaking by 2040. BHP cannot see a pathway for zero carbon steel by 2050 and has not set any firm target relating to steel, be it net zero by 2050 or other. This divergence is probably in part attributable to just different styles for the companies. So FMG has a bit of a habit of setting quite ambitious stretch goals for themselves. BHP is more inclined to only set targets it has modelled one or more pathways for. However, I think it's really important to keep in mind that valid questions should be asked about whether BHP's lower ambition relating to steel decarbonisation might also be attributable to their sizable metallurgical coal business and current plans to divest parts of that business. Potential plans to divest even all of it in the future for all we know. Dan touched on some of these things. I won't go into it in too much detail, but I mean, I think it's fair to say that steel decarbonisation of the steel sector is a rapidly evolving space. Bloomberg New Energy Finance modelling suggests that by 2050, zero carbon processing of steel with green hydrogen or electrolysis will be the most cost-effective option. That includes in comparison to use of CCS or offsets as well. So yeah, it's definitely a space to watch. Okay, so with regard to capital alignment, BHP has not made an explicit commitment to align its capital allocation with a 1.5 degree pathway. They talk in the Climate Change Transition Action Plan, or the CTAP, excuse us for jumping around with our acronyms, but they talk about sort of consideration of a 1.5 scenario in their capital allocation frameworks, but are not willing to make that firm commitment. And that's pretty clear in what they're actually doing on the ground as well. So bearing in mind that both Dan and Steve's study on unextractable fossil fuels, as well as the IEA net zero scenario, highlight that we can't really have any more new coal, oil or gas facilities beyond 2021 opened, or any further coal mine extensions. However, in BHP's FY22 CapEx guidance, they've flagged $2.3 billion for their petroleum division and $600 million for their coal assets, of a total of US $9 billion capital allocation. There's also some potential new metallurgical coal mines within the BMA business, Red Hill Mining, which would produce 14 million tonnes per annum, and the Saraji East Mine, which would produce 11 million tonnes per annum. They're pursuing a mine life extension for the Caval Ridge metallurgical coal mine, which would take it out to 2056. And those disappointing efforts to get an extension for the Mount Arthur thermal coal mine as well out to 2045 to support their planned divestment. Okay, moving on to divestment. So this is a big sort of evolving challenge that's happening across the market. Lots of companies looking to divest of their more carbon intensive and fossil fuel assets. And I think a question has to be asked around the ethics of a company like BHP, which is on the record saying that a 1.5 degree scenario is better for their business. If they've decided that they no longer want exposure to fossil fuels, partly due to the climate impacts, is it appropriate that they are divesting those businesses to companies that clearly have plans to exploit those resources and invest in them and see them producing, and therefore threatening our capacity to limit warming to 1.5 degrees? It's a real, we see that this issue is going to get a lot of attention over the next 12 months and beyond, since there's such a significant amount of activity in the marketplace. For BHP, you would be aware that they're seeking to divest their BMC metallurgical coal assets. That includes 3 potential planned new mines. For thermal coal, they've divested the remaining share of Cerrejón to Glencore, and for the Mount Arthur coal mine, there are rumours in the marketplace that Peabody may be looking to acquire that asset. And of course, there is the proposed merger of the petroleum division with Woodside, which will significantly contribute to the likelihood of the Scarborough and Pluto 2 development proceeding, which Carbon Tracker has deemed to be incompatible with even 2.7 degrees of warming. So these divestments are clearly not leading to good climate outcomes, or clearly will not lead to good climate outcomes. They may decrease BHP's transition risk exposure, but they'll do nothing for BHP's physical climate risk exposure. Okay, just quickly touching on funding commitments for decarbonisation. So BHP has a $400 million climate investment program over a 5-year period. Compared to peers, this is not a significant sum by comparison. So Fortescue Metals Group, Rio Tinto and Vale are all allocating significantly more funds towards decarbonisation than BHP. On just transition, so BHP didn't address this at length within the Climate Change Transition Action Plan. This is likely due to the fact that the Climate Action 100 benchmark is yet to set its benchmark and start assessing companies on that. However, there is a lot of literature and insight on what a just transition looks like, and BHP has not explicitly made a commitment to decarbonising in line with a just transition. There's sort of two factors to just transition. There's the environmental remediation side of things, divestment of aging assets like those in the Bass Strait, like Mount Arthur. We'll see rehabilitation responsibilities being transferred to the buyers of those assets. So it's really critical that the calibre of those buyers and their financial strength is considered in those transactions to ensure those environmental remediation commitments are honoured. However, we emphasise that really BHP should be increasingly confronting the urgent need to wind down these assets themselves and rehabilitate them in a responsible manner, particularly in the case of Mount Arthur. Obviously, just transition also applies to workforce transition and ensuring that there is decent work and that workforces are appropriately trained and enabled to transition to jobs within the low carbon economy. We have seen some concerning signs of BHP reportedly telling Hunter Valley mine workers that they have to accept transfers to interstate mines or resign from their positions. So that that's an evolving issue and also something to watch as over the coming year or so. And just finally on climate governance. So this is an area of strength for BHP. They have really good structures in terms of, having their climate team working with their executive leadership team and reporting through to the board. Their remuneration framework with climate change measures making up 10% of the short-term incentive is significant. Although we note that is linked to not a particularly ambitious short-term target, and there is a risk that if BHP doesn't increase its targets, then there's a rewarding of performance that is not aligned with the Paris Agreement. Okay, so this is sort of, I won't read through this slide, but it's pretty clear that, ACCR recommends voting against BHP's Climate Transition Action Plan. We don't see that as the end of the world. We see that as an opportunity to then start a conversation with BHP about them really ratcheting up their alignment with Paris, particularly since this is a once in 3-year opportunity to have a say on BHP's transition strategy. Those other points there is a summary from the front end of our investor briefing with which covers the majority of what I've discussed today and more. We've just recently updated that briefing. I understand it was attached when we issued the reminder for the webinar. So please, we encourage you to read that and also welcome questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Harriet. All right, well, now we'll move on to the Q&A portion of this evening. It's great to see some questions in the Q&A section. I might start with the first one, and I'll throw this to Dan and Harriet. Do you break out assessment at commodity level, for example, copper versus coal? And do you weight the commodity exposure? How would you expect the divestment of its petroleum assets influence your assessment?
Thanks, Fiona. I think I've addressed the petroleum divestment. Any divestment of fossil fuel assets that will prolong their lives or see them be exploited further, that is incompatible with 1.5 degree pathway, is definitely concerning and has influenced our assessment for sure. Breaking out assessment at a commodity level, we certainly have assessed the emissions profile at a commodity level through the heat map we provided earlier. Naturally, there are far greater challenges with decarbonising coal assets than there are copper. So there is some nuance in our analysis there. Yeah, that's probably, no, we have not done weighting for commodity exposure to answer that question. Dan, was there anything you wanted to add?
I think the only thing we'd add there is that the renewable PPAs that BHP announced last year will decarbonise the Scope 2 emissions from copper, which are the bulk of BHP's Scope 2 emissions. So I think that takes out maybe 3/4 of the electricity usage from the copper mines in Chile.
Sorry, I just want to note that actually that question was for InfluenceMap for Joe.
Was it?
Yeah, we just got an extra comment there. Throwing to you, Joe.
No, I have nothing more to add to that. What they said, to be honest. Thanks.
All right, no worries. The next question is for Dan and Steve at UCL. So what role do you think carbon offsets have in the decarbonisation journey?
That's a good question. Thank you. So, I mean, we don't, in terms of the modelling, we're not able to model carbon offsets from a company level. I mean, what I would say is that I think there's a significant transparency issue with carbon offsets. And I think there's an accounting issue with carbon offsets at the moment, in the sense that, for example, if you're going to use a carbon offset, or if you're suggesting a carbon offset to avoid deforestation, that's not offsetting carbon that you're pumping into the atmosphere. That's simply just avoiding the loss of a carbon sink. So I think there's a real accounting issue with offsets at the moment, and I think it is distracting from the, this absolutely critical need to reverse fossil fuel production and put ourselves on these decline pathways for oil, coal, and gas. And I think that certainly at the moment the offsets, in terms of the carbon accounting, that's it doesn't seem to add up, and it's avoiding from the need to start declining, or certainly globally, production.
Thanks, Dan. And Harriet and Dangosha, I was wondering if you could add anything onto that, especially because BHP does have that terminology, offsets as required throughout their CTAP.
Yeah, I think we addressed a concern around sort of emerging science. There's also concerns around the climate resilience of tree planting programs, their vulnerability to wildfire, the actual availability of land to meet the commitments that companies are making. There's also emerging concerns even within the supposedly highly reputable Australian carbon offset market, the ACCR market, around the credibility and meaning how significant the emissions reductions are that are being achieved through some of those methods. So there's a whole range of concerns with the credibility and impact that offsets are actually having for decarbonisation.
Great, thank you. Next question is, in your opinion, what could BHP do better when influencing its steel customers to reduce emissions? This can include investments, public policy positions, or regulations. I'll throw that out to anyone.
I mean, we're not suggesting it is easy. However, there probably is a higher level of sort of passivity around the way BHP is approaching the task, especially compared to, say, how FMG are rising to the challenge and really taking control. Not only are they setting bold targets, but they're working really hard on commercialising green hydrogen to ensure that they are met. Naturally, another key area for focus for BHP in this subject does relate to their industry association membership. Number of their industry associations are aggressively lobbying for opening new coal mines, including metallurgical coal mines. So that is directly at odds with any effort to limit the climate impacts from iron ore processing. Dan, would you like to?
Yeah, I'll jump in there. I think there's two other issues I'd raise. The first being the quantum of BHP's investment to date. I think it's US $65 million towards decarbonising steel. I think, as Harriet mentioned, more than $11 billion in profit last year, and I think it was a record number the previous year. I think it was somewhere in the region of $8 or $9 billion the previous year. So, and it is being dwarfed by some of its peers. So there's the quantum, and I think the other issue here is that, and there's news in Australia today that Korean steel company POSCO is on the brink of some kind of agreement with the Australian government to develop, to look at green steel using Australian hydrogen produced in Australia, or at least ammonia. So BHP needs to be more public about working with those kinds of initiatives, particularly at government level, rather than actually opposing climate policy, which is what a number of its industry associations have done for many years.
Great, thanks, Dan and Harriet. The next question is on BHP's use of goals and targets. So I guess we'll stay with ACCR on that one. BHP's use of goals and targets, are they not just being honest in their use of the term goal when the use of green hydrogen in steel production is not yet at a scalable level for reducing CO2 in steel production? Were the technology of green hydrogen use scalable, then your argument that it should be a target would be much stronger.
Well, I mean, I guess we made the point that there is an iron ore miner who is willing to set targets and specifically linked to the commercialisation and large-scale use of green hydrogen in steel making. So yeah, I think it just comes down to levels of ambition and potentially corporate culture as well in terms of approach to target setting.
Great. There's another question. What are your thoughts on the ambition of the ICCM recent net zero goals statement? Can anyone from the panel answer that one?
I confess I don't have a view. Apologies.
That's okay, moving on. Question to ACCR, would an annual say on climate commitment from BHP have changed your recommendation? To what extent does the direction of travel in a climate plan factor into your recommendation?
I think we were pretty clear up the front that for us, Paris alignment and seeking to align with a 1.5 degree trajectory is the primary mechanism through which we assess transition plans. So an annual commitment is unlikely to change our recommendation, but it would certainly give us confidence that there might be scope for further conversations and presentation of updated plans and associated targets for the investors' consideration.
I might add to that, Fiona. The direction of travel is important. There's no doubt about that. But the targets, particularly the operational emission targets that BHP has set, have been in place for a number of years. So you could argue that the direction of travel is actually stagnant. It's not becoming more progressive, and BHP has resisted, I guess, the investor push to take more accountability for Scope 3 emissions.
We've got 1 minute left. I thought, ACCR, could you comment on the CA100 statement in support of the CTAP?
Over to you, Dan.
I'd rather pass on that. We have engaged with at least one of the lead investors for Climate Action 100 on BHP. I guess we can agree to disagree.
Okay, and with that, we're out of time, but I want to thank everyone for joining us this evening, and a big thank you to our panelists. We're happy to take questions on notice as well, so please feel free to reach out and contact us. Our details are on our website, and our CTAP analysis is also on our website, and as Dan mentioned, our slides will also be uploaded there. So thank you all for joining us, and I hope to see you again.